June 18, 1944. Normandy, France. Sergeant Raymond Kozlowski lay motionless inside a concrete grain silo 40 feet above Saint-Germain-d'Iel. His Springfield in 1903 A4 resting on a makeshift bipod. Through an 8-inch ventilation slot, he observed the German command post below. Officers moving between buildings with the confidence of men beyond the reach of American rifles. Kozlowski had been here 17 hours, and in that time he had mapped their patterns, watched them conduct business in the open, because no sniper had found position to observe the secure rear area. They were about to learn that security was an illusion when someone thought like a farmer instead of a soldier. Raymond Kozlowski had grown up on a dairy farm outside Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where every structure served multiple purposes. The grain silos weren't just storage. They were observation posts from which you could survey entire fields, spot broken fences, identify predators, plan the day's work with perspective that ground-level observation could never provide. As a boy, he'd spent countless hours inside those silos, comfortable in confined spaces, patient in waiting, understanding that height provided advantage and stillness was its own camouflage. He learned to read land from above, to identify patterns and predict movement, to understand that animals and people both followed paths of least resistance. When the draft notice arrived in January 1943, he reported without complaint. A quiet man who stood 6 feet tall, but seemed shorter because he habitually hunched his shoulders, a farm habit from working in low barns. Basic training at Camp Grant, Illinois, revealed skills that surprised instructors but seemed natural to farm life. Kozlowski could shoot with precision born from years of varmint control, where every cartridge cost money. He could remain motionless for hours, a talent from hunting Wisconsin winters where movement meant failure. He understood wind and weather with instinctive knowledge, and possessed a farmer's practical problem-solving mindset that valued results over theory. Recognizing his potential, instructors recommended him for sniper training. By August 1943, he was at Fort Benning learning the formal craft of what he'd practiced informally his entire life. Sniper school taught him military methodology, range estimation, windage calculation, target priority selection based on military value. He learned concealment techniques, field craft, counter-sniper tactics, and the psychological demands of killing individual human beings at distances where you could see their faces. Some students struggle with that intimate violence, but Kozlowski approached it with the same pragmatism he brought to farm work. It was necessary, it served a purpose, and dwelling on feelings didn't change reality. He graduated in the top 15%, was promoted to sergeant, and assigned to the 29th Infantry Division preparing for the invasion of France. D-Day found Kozlowski wading through Omaha Beach with the second wave, his sniper rifle wrapped in waterproof canvas. The overwhelming violence of German defenses, bodies in the water and scattered across sand, burned into memory with dramatic clarity. He made it to the seawall, found cover in a shell crater, and spent 6 hours engaging German positions, providing Overwatcher infantry attempting to advance up the bluffs. He recorded for confirmed kills that day. By nightfall, American forces had secured precarious foothold, and Kozlowski was inland, beginning the brutal work of pushing through hedgerows toward objectives that seemed to recede with every advance. The next 2 weeks taught him that Normandy required different tactics. The hedgerows, ancient earthen barriers topped with dense vegetation, created a landscape where visibility extended only to the next field boundary, where every advance was a separate battle, where German defenders held every advantage. Traditional sniper tactics struggled in an environment where line of sight rarely exceeded 200 yards. Kozlowski adapted, learning to work closer to enemy lines, to use dense vegetation for approaches that would have been suicidal in open country. But he recognized fundamental limitations. Ground-level positions could only observe what the hedgerows allowed. The breakthrough came on June 17th during an advance towards Saint-Germain-d'Iel, a village serving as a German command center coordinating defensive operations across 3 miles. Artillery had pounded the area, infantry had probed the perimeter, but Germans held firm. Kozlowski's company was tasked with eliminating German leadership, but repeated attempts had failed. German officers operated from secure rear areas beyond ground-level observation, protected by multiple defensive lines and alert sentries. studying the problem from a forward observation post. Kozlowski saw the silo. It stood half a mile behind German lines, a concrete cylinder rising from a farmyard, its top visible above surrounding buildings. To officers planning the operation, it was just another farm structure. But to Kozlowski, who had spent his childhood in such structures, it was an observation platform, an elevated firing position providing sight lines impossible from ground level. The silo was inside German-held territory, requiring infiltration through enemy lines. But Kozlowski understood something doctrine didn't emphasize. The best positions were often behind enemy lines because that's where enemies felt safe, where they dropped their guard. He spent that afternoon studying terrain, identifying an infiltration route utilizing a drainage ditch through the hedgerows. The final 200 yards would be dangerous, crossing open farmland, but he calculated a night approach during early morning hours when sentries were least alert would minimize detection. He didn't ask permission because he knew it would be denied. Instead, he told his spotter, Private First Class Dennis O'Brien, that he was going on solo reconnaissance and would return within 24 hours. Kozlowski began his infiltration at 0200 hours on June 18th, moving through darkness with slow, patient advance. He carried his Springfield rifle, 200 rounds, 3 days of rations, water, and minimal equipment. The drainage ditch provided excellent concealment for the first 1,000 yards. He encountered no sentries. German defensive positions focused on hedgerows and obvious approach routes, not drainage features. By 0400 hours, he was positioned at the ditch terminus, studying the open ground separating him from the silo. The farmyard lay quiet in pre-dawn darkness. The silo was a dark mass against slightly lighter sky, its access door hanging partially open on damaged hinges. Kozlowski waited 30 minutes, watching for German presence. Seeing none, he moved across open ground in a low crawl, covering 200 yards in 40 minutes. Pausing frequently to observe and listen, he reached the silo without incident, slipped through the damaged door, and found himself in a space that smelled exactly like the silos of his childhood. Concrete dust, old grain, mouse droppings, and the peculiar musty scent of agricultural buildings long abandoned. The interior was darker than night outside. Kozlowski waited for his eyes to adjust before beginning his ascent. The silo had an internal ladder, rusty but intact, leading upward some 50 feet. He climbed slowly, testing each rung, his rifle slung across his back, his movements producing faint metallic sounds that seemed thunderous in confined space. At the top, he found what he'd hoped for, a circular platform with ventilation slots around the circumference, narrow openings designed for air circulation, but perfectly sized for rifle observation. The slots were 8 inches wide and 2 feet tall, positioned at chest height, providing sight lines across the entire farmyard and into the village beyond. Kozlowski settled into position with methodical care that separated successful snipers from casualties. He established his primary firing position facing the farmhouse identified as the German command post, then set up alternate positions covering different sectors. He used his pack and spare clothing to create padding allowing him to maintain position for extended periods. He organized ammunition within easy reach, arranged water and rations for access without movement, and prepared waste management solutions because leaving would compromise the operation. Then he settled in to wait, beginning the patient observation that was 90% of sniper work. As dawn broke over Normandy on June 18th, the farmyard came alive with activity that validated every assumption. German soldiers emerged from buildings and foxholes, beginning morning routines with casual confidence of troops in rear areas. Officers appeared from the farmhouse, moving to an outbuilding serving as a map room. Kozlowski watched through his scope, cataloging faces and ranks, identifying who held command authority. He observed movement patterns, building a mental map of German command structure. He didn't fire during those first hours, understanding that patience was critical, that his first shot would reveal his position and end the advantage of surprise. By mid-morning, he had identified what appeared to be a Wehrmacht Hauptmann, a captain who moved with command authority, who was saluted by other officers and deferred to in conversations. The captain emerged from the farmhouse at 10:40 hours, walking toward a staff car without haste or concern. Kozlowski settled into his firing position, his breathing steady, his mind calculating range, elevation, and wind with automatic precision. The range was 420 yards, a moderate distance for the Springfield. Wind was negligible. The target was moving at walking pace, predictable and steady. Kozlowski placed the crosshairs on the captain's center mass, led slightly from movement, exhaled halfway and held, then pressed the trigger with smooth, steady pressure. Through the scope, Kozlowski saw the captain stumble and fall, the impact dropping him instantly. There was a moment of stunned confusion among German soldiers, men stopping to stare at their fallen officer. Then chaos erupted as soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting warnings, scanning hedgerows and buildings to the shooter they assumed must be at ground level. No one looked up at the silo. No one considered the shot might have come from elevation, from inside their own rear area, from a position they'd never secured because doctrine didn't suggest silos require clearing. Kozlowski remained perfectly still, watching the response, learning how German troops reacted to sniper fire. For 3 hours, he observed as German soldiers searched for a sniper who wasn't where they expected. They focused attention on hedgerows to the west, setting up defensive positions and sending out patrols. Meanwhile, Kozlowski sat motionless in the silo, his position undetected. At 1400 hours, a Wehrmacht Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, emerged from the farmhouse and began organizing the defensive response with calm efficiency. Kozlowski noted him as a high-value target, but didn't fire immediately, wanting to observe the full response. The lieutenant moved between positions, checking fields of fire, repositioning soldiers, transforming chaos into organized defense. At 1530 hours, the lieutenant returned to the farmyard, moving toward the staff car where the captain had fallen, presumably to retrieve documents. Kozlowski took him with a shot almost identical to his first. Center mass, for 100-yard range, minimal wind correction. The lieutenant dropped without sound, and the chaos that followed was worse because now German soldiers understood they faced a sniper who could strike at will, who was positioned somewhere they couldn't locate. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Soldiers dug for cover that wouldn't protect them from elevated fire, and defensive coordination began to unravel. Kozlowski watched dispassionately, recognizing he'd achieved more than elimination of individual targets. He'd created uncertainty, disrupted command cohesion, transformed what should have been secure rear area into a place where German officers feared to show themselves. He remained in position through the night, allowing German soldiers to exhaust themselves searching for a threat they couldn't find. By morning of June 19th, the German command post was operating under completely different protocols. Officers moved between buildings using covered routes, never exposing themselves in the open. But Kozlowski had patience from farm life where work proceeded on nature's schedule, and he knew eventually necessity would force someone to expose themselves, to make mistakes born from fatigue and stress. The opportunity came at 1100 hours when a staff car arrived carrying what appeared to be a Sturmbannführer, an SS major whose insignia was visible through Kozlowski's scope. The major moved toward the farmhouse with arrogant confidence that suggested he considered himself above common threats. Kozlowski put a round through his chest from 430 yards, the shot taken through a gap between buildings that provided a sight line for perhaps 3 seconds. The major went down hard, and the effect on German morale was catastrophic. If even SS officers weren't safe, if high-ranking commanders could be eliminated in supposedly secure areas, then nowhere was safe and no one was beyond reach. Over the following 6 days, Kozlowski remained in the silo, leaving his position only during complete darkness to address physical necessities before immediately returning to his observation platform. He survived on cold rations and water, maintained position through summer heat that turned the concrete silo into an oven, ignored discomfort and fatigue to the same determination that carried him through Wisconsin winters and farm work that never ended. He fired 28 shots during those 6 days, each one carefully selected, each target chosen for maximum military value. He eliminated 3 more captains, 5 lieutenants, 2 SS officers, and a collection of senior NCOs whose experience was irreplaceable. The effect on German defensive operations was profound and immediate. Without effective command coordination, German units in the sector began operating independently, losing the synchronized defensive response that had made hedgerow fighting so costly. Communication broke down as officers feared using visible command posts. Artillery support became less effective as forward observers couldn't coordinate safely. Counterattacks lost cohesion because planning required officers to gather in exposed locations. The entire defensive structure, which depended on experienced leadership maintaining discipline under pressure, began to crack under the weight of systematic command elimination. American forces attacking the sector reported encountering increasingly disorganized resistance. German soldiers who fought bravely, but without coordination. Kozlowski's absence from his unit had been noted, and by June 20th, his company commander had initiated inquiries threatening to escalate into a missing in action report. Private O'Brien, knowing Kozlowski was on an unauthorized operation, but trusting his sergeant's skills, had delayed reporting as long as possible with vague explanations. But by the 23rd, delay was no longer sustainable, and O'Brien confessed what little he knew to Lieutenant Harrison, the company commander. Harrison was angry at the unauthorized operation, but intrigued by O'Brien's description of Kozlowski's infiltration plan and his hypothesis about the silo position. Rather than immediately reporting to battalion, Harrison decided to investigate personally, leading a patrol toward an area where O'Brien believed Kozlowski had infiltrated. The patrol reached the German command post area on the evening of June 23rd, approaching cautiously through hedgerows, expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found German positions that appeared abandoned or lightly held, soldiers who retreated at first contact rather than mounting determined defense. Harrison pushed forward carefully, his tactical instincts screaming that something was wrong. His patrol reached the farmyard as darkness fell, finding buildings showing signs of recent occupation but no current German presence. And there, rising from the farmyard like a monument, was the silo. Harrison approached the structure cautiously, calling out identification to avoid friendly fire if Kozlowski was inside. He heard movement above, then Kozlowski's voice, flat with exhaustion but unmistakably alive, calling down that he was descending. Minutes later, Kozlowski emerged from the silo door, his uniform filthy, his face gone from 6 days of minimal rations and maximum stress, but his rifle meticulously clean and his equipment organized with the same care he'd maintained throughout. He rendered a salute, then reported in a voice that suggested he was reciting a grocery list rather than describing 6 days behind enemy lines. Harrison listened to the report with growing astonishment that transformed into professional appreciation. 28 confirmed kills, all officers or senior NCOs, all taken from a position German forces had never considered securing, all achieved through patient observation and precise shooting that exemplified everything sniper doctrine taught, but rarely achieved. The tactical effect on German defensive operations was already visible in the reduced resistance Harrison's patrol had encountered. But Harrison also recognized that Kozlowski had violated orders, had conducted an unauthorized operation that could have resulted in his death or capture. The return to American lines took 3 hours of careful movement, and by dawn on June 24th, Kozlowski was back with his company, being debriefed by officers who struggled to balance disciplinary concerns against operational success. Captain Wendell, the battalion operations officer, conducted the initial debriefing with a mix of anger and admiration that seemed to wear visibly across his face. He documented Kozlowski's unauthorized infiltration, his violation of standing orders, his decision to remain in position 6 days beyond any reasonable expectation of return. But he also documented the kills, the disruption of German command, the tactical advantage gained through innovation no doctrine manual had anticipated. The question of whether to court-martial Kozlowski or commend him hung in the air throughout the debriefing. That review came 2 days later when Colonel Patterson, the regimental commander, interviewed Kozlowski personally. Patterson was a West Point graduate who believed in doctrine and order, but also understood that warfare rewarded adaptation and punished rigidity. He questioned Kozlowski extensively about his reasoning, his farm background that had inspired the tactic, and the practical details of surviving 6 days in an elevated high position behind enemy lines. Kozlowski answered each question with the same practical directness that characterized his entire approach to soldiering, explaining what he'd done and why without embellishment. When Patterson asked whether Kozlowski understood he'd violated orders and risked court-martial, the sergeant replied that he understood but believed the tactical value justified the risk, and that he'd make the same decision again under similar circumstances. Patterson made his decision based not on what regulation prescribed, but on what results demanded. He formally reprimanded Kozlowski for unauthorized operations, a notation in his service record that carried no practical consequences. Simultaneously, he recommended Kozlowski for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. More significantly, Patterson ordered the Division Intelligence Section to study Kozlowski's technique and develop tactical guidance for employing elevated high positions in sniper operations. Within a week, intelligence officers were briefing sniper teams across the division on the concept of using silos, church towers, and other vertical structures as observation and firing positions. The technique spread through informal networks faster than official channels could document. Snipers talked to other snipers, and the account of the Wisconsin farmer who'd killed 28 German officers from inside a silo became legend that inspired imitation. By July, American snipers across Normandy were seeking out elevated positions, infiltrating behind enemy lines to occupy structures that provided height advantages, adapting Kozlowski's core insight to whatever vertical features the local terrain offered. Church steeples became prized positions despite moral questions. Water towers, windmills, abandoned factory chimneys, even large trees with sufficient concealment, all became potential sniper hides that German forces struggled to counter. The German response was necessarily reactive and never fully effective. They began systematically destroying vertical structures in forward areas, demolishing silos and towers that might provide sniper positions. They posted guards on churches and prominent buildings. They modified patrol patterns to avoid predictable routes observable from elevation. But every countermeasure carried costs in resources and manpower, and the psychological effect of knowing American snipers might be watching from any elevated position created persistent stress that degraded German combat effectiveness. Officers became reluctant to gather visibly. Communication suffered from excessive caution, and the overall tempo of German operations slowed under the weight of constant vigilance. Kozlowski himself continued operating as a sniper through the remainder of the Normandy campaign and into the advance across France. He never again conducted an operation as extended as the 6 days in the silo, partly because officers now monitored his activities more closely and partly because the tactical situation evolved. But he continued employing elevated positions whenever terrain permitted, and his confirmed kill count grew steadily through summer and fall of 1944. Other snipers adopted not just a technique, but the patient, methodical approach that characterizes work. Understanding that tactical advantage came not just from elevation, but from willingness to remain in position for extended periods, observing and learning before taking shots that would have maximum effect. By September 1944, when American forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France toward Germany, the silo tactic had been incorporated into official Army sniper doctrine, though without specific credit to Kozlowski. Field manuals updated to include guidance on employing vertical structures as sniper positions. Training programs at Fort Benning began teaching the technique, and new snipers arriving in Europe came equipped with both skills and doctrinal authorization to seek elevated positions that their predecessors had discovered through individual innovation. Kozlowski was wounded in October during fighting around Aachen, taking shrapnel from a German mortar round that caught him during a position change. The wounds were serious enough to require evacuation to a field hospital and then to England for extended recovery, effectively ending his combat service. He spent the remainder of the war recovering and was discharged in July 1945 with medical retirement, his service record noting a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and final rank of Staff Sergeant. The record also noted 93 confirmed kills over 14 months of combat operations, making him one of the more successful American snipers of the European theater, though far from the most famous. He returned to Wisconsin in August 1945, taking up dairy farming again on the land his family had worked for generations. He rarely spoke about the war, rarely mentioned the silo or the 28 officers or the technique that had spread through the Army. When asked directly by curious neighbors or fellow veterans, he would acknowledge he'd been a sniper, would confirm he'd done some shooting in Normandy, but he deflected attention with practiced ease. The farm demanded attention. The cows needed milking regardless of what had happened in France, and Kozlowski threw himself into agricultural work with the same methodical focus he'd once applied to observing German command posts. The tactical innovation he pioneered continued to influence military doctrine long after his return to civilian life. Employment of elevated sniper positions became standard practice not just in the American Army, but in other Western militaries that studied lessons of a European campaign. The sightline advantages, the psychological impact of strikes from unexpected vectors, the disruption of enemy command and control achieved through systematic targeting of officers from positions they couldn't easily counter. All these elements became part of established knowledge that military academies taught and field manuals codified. But the origin story, the account of the Wisconsin dairy farmer who thought to hide in a silo because that was what he knew from childhood, gradually faded from official histories. Part of that fading reflected the military's institutional discomfort with individual innovation occurring outside established channels. The fact that Kozlowski had conducted his most famous operation without authorization, that he'd violated orders to achieve results doctrine hadn't anticipated, created a narrative problem for an organization that valued discipline and hierarchy. It was easier to present the elevated sniper tactic as an inevitable evolution of existing doctrine, a natural development emerging from collective tactical experimentation, rather than acknowledge it had originated with a single soldier's unauthorized operation that easily could have resulted in disaster. Official histories of the Normandy campaign mention employment of vertical structures as sniper positions, noted effectiveness of such tactics against German command elements, but rarely identified specific individuals who pioneered the technique. Kozlowski himself seemed unbothered by the lack of recognition, an attitude reflecting both his personality and cultural background. Wisconsin farm culture valued practical results over public acknowledgement, measured success by harvest yields rather than newspaper headlines, and considered self-promotion distasteful. He'd done what needed doing, had survived to come home, and had returned to work that mattered in immediate, tangible ways. The technique had spread and had saved American lives. That was outcome enough without requiring his name attached. When military historians occasionally contacted him in later years, seeking to document development of American sniper tactics, he provided factual information without embellishment, answered questions accurately but minimally, and declined opportunities to present himself as an innovator or hero. The men who had served with him in B Company, 29th Infantry Division, told the story differently. At reunions and informal gatherings, the account of Sergeant Kozlowski's 6 days in the silo became legend, not through exaggeration, but through addition of context only fellow soldiers could appreciate. They spoke about the courage required to infiltrate behind enemy lines alone, the discipline needed to remain in position for nearly a week, the skill demonstrated by 28 confirmed kills without a single miss that brought counterfire down on his position. They talked about how the technique had spread, how other snipers adopted it, how the tactical landscape shifted, because one man thought to apply farm knowledge to military problems. In those informal histories, preserved in memory rather than official documents, Kozlowski's contribution was neither forgotten nor minimized. Dennis O'Brien, who had been Kozlowski's spotter and had covered for him during the unauthorized operation, maintained contact after the war and occasionally visited the Wisconsin farm. In interviews conducted decades later, O'Brien provided the most detailed accounts of Kozlowski's tactical thinking and personality, describing a man who approached warfare with the same methodical pragmatism he brought to farming, who saw problems in terms of practical solutions rather than doctrinal compliance, and who possessed extraordinary patience that made him ideally suited to sniper work. O'Brien's testimony, preserved in oral history projects, provides some of the few detailed records of how the silo tactic was conceived and executed. The broader influence of Kozlowski's innovation extended beyond World War II into later conflicts where American forces employed sniper tactics. In Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent military operations, the principle of seeking elevated positions that provided superior sight lines and psychological advantage remained fundamental to sniper doctrine. The specific structures changed based on local terrain and architecture, but the underlying insight that height provided tactical advantage and that patient observation from unexpected positions could disrupt enemy operations more effectively than reactive shooting remained constant. Modern sniper training emphasized position selection considering vertical as well as horizontal factors, and instructors taught the value of infiltrating behind enemy lines to occupy positions enemies didn't anticipate. The direct lineage from Kozlowski's silo to contemporary sniper doctrine was rarely acknowledged in official curricula, but the tactical DNA was unmistakable. Kozlowski lived a long life, farming in Wisconsin until his retirement in 1978, then spent his final years in quiet comfort earned through decades of hard work. He died in 1994 at age 73. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioning his military service, but focusing primarily on his contributions to local agriculture and community organizations. The obituary noted he'd been a decorated combat veteran who'd served in France and Germany, that he'd been wounded in action, and that he'd returned to farm the land his grandfather had settled. There was no mention of silos or sniper tactics, or the 28 German officers whose deaths had helped break German defensive cohesion in Normandy. To his community, he was Ray Kozlowski, farmer and neighbor and quiet man who had served when called, and then came home to live a life defined by practical work and modest accomplishment. But in the informal archives of American military innovation, in stories told by veterans and tactical lessons taught to new snipers, Raymond Kozlowski occupies a unique place. He represents the archetype of the ordinary man who brings extraordinary capability to warfare not through formal training alone, but through application of skills and knowledge developed in civilian life. His innovation emerged not from doctrine or tactical theory, but from the simple insight that what worked on Wisconsin dairy farms might work on Norman battlefields, that structures built for one purpose could serve another. That advantage often came from thinking differently than enemies anticipated. The fact that his contribution was never formally recognized, that official histories rarely mention his name, reflects both institutional dynamics and his own preference for quiet competence over public acclaim. The story of a silo sniper, the Wisconsin farmer who killed 28 German officers and changed how armies employed elevated positions, survives in a way many important military innovations survive, through informal networks of soldiers who understand that doctrine evolves through individual experimentation, that tactical advantage often comes from violating expectations, and that the difference between brilliant innovation and reckless violation of orders is frequently determined by results rather than prior authorization. Kozlowski's legacy is written not in official citations or history books, but in the doctrine that every sniper learns, in a technique that has saved countless lives by giving soldiers advantages their enemies didn't anticipate, and in the understanding that warfare rewards those who can think beyond what regulations prescribe to discover what circumstances demand. He was a farmer who became a soldier who remained fundamentally a farmer in his thinking, and that synthesis of perspectives created tactical innovation that reshaped how modern militaries employ snipers in combat operations. The Army never officially credited him. The history books rarely mention his name, but the technique survives as testimony to the insight that sometimes the best military innovations come from those who think least like conventional military planners.